Let's look at nasals. And We'll start by talking about the production. And the production of nasals is created when the velopharyngeal port is open to allow airflow to go into the nasal cavities. Ordinarily, that port is closed so that our resonance is what we call oral resonance in the mouth, but we open that port to shift the airflow to the nasal cavities, and the sound actually comes out through the nose. Now, in order to allow this to happen, there's also occlusion in the oral tract. So for the we are closing the lips to make the labial closure. For the N, we are creating closure by the tongue at the alveolar ridge. And then for the we are creating closure in the velar place of articulation. So we have occlusion in the vocal tract, and we have opening of the velopharyngeal port. Now, the sound type of nasals is a periodic sound type. There's a specific frequency component. You could sing on an or an N or an ng. The formants are actually relatively steady state. So in contrast with the glides and the semivowels where the formants really changed quickly over the course of production, that change doesn't happen in the nasals. It's very steady state. It's voiced, so there's the fundamental frequency that's present at an average of 250 hertz. Now, the acoustic characteristics, some acoustic principles to think about is that when we are sending sound through the nasal cavities, we're sending sound through a longer tube than if we were sending sound in the ordinary way through the vocal tract. So with a longer tube, you have a lower resonant frequency. You're going to have more low frequencies in that sound. And it also affects the upper formants. And the effect is this way. You have this increased low frequency energy that's called a nasal murmur. There's a massing of low frequency energy at about 250 hertz, and it actually extends a little bit below 250 hertz toward the fundamental frequency. The higher formants, F1, F2, F3, get really weakened. So the reason why we think of nasals as being so low in pitch is not only because you have this increased low frequency energy, but you remove some of that high frequency energy that we ordinarily hear in orally resonated consonants and vowels. They're not as strong, so we really get that richness of the low frequencies. There are some sound alikes that I'm going to bring up here that we will bring up in Lecture 5 when we're talking about the Ling 6 sound test. If you recall, the first formant in oo from the vowel lecture, the first formant in oo is also cited as being around 250 hertz. And so it is possible that oo and can sound very much like one another. There is a difference, however, and that is that the first formant in oo is actually generally a little higher than 250 hertz, and the nasal murmur in the is a little bit closer to 250 and slightly below. So if you don't have adequate low frequency energy in a child's amplification or in the processing strategy, for example, in an implant, the child may think that, or the listener may think that the and the oo are the same sound. You've got to have that extra low frequency access in order to hear that nasal murmur that's associated with the the in order to hear it clearly. And we'll talk about this again in the next lecture, but I wanted to foreshadow it in this one. So let's take the same information and map it onto perceptual clues for the 3 dimensions of consonant production: manner, place, and voicing. The manner is we know that we're hearing a nasal, that there's nasal resonance because of this nasal murmur at 250 hertz. Now, place is determined by the second formant transition in and out of the nasal consonant at approximately 1,000 hertz. The length of the oral tract determines the resonance. And I'm not giving you any specific numbers, but I want you to think about this principle. So I've got a situation where I've got sound coming through the nasal tract. And let's say I'm going to produce an M, the and so the lips are closed. So the potential areas of resonance can be that long nasal tract, but there's also a side resonance, and that is that oral tract from the glottis to the lips. So you've got, for that particular consonant, you have a lower second formant transition between the consonant and the vowel. Now, as we move to the alveolar placement, the N, I'm now going to close the oral tract at the alveolar ridge. I still have that long nasal resonance as sound goes out the nose, but now this side tube, that's the oral tract, it's a little bit shorter when I close it for the N than I do when I closed it for the with the lips. A little bit shorter, and so the second formant transition between the vowel and the consonant is a little bit higher because it's a shorter tube, and the shorter the tube, the higher frequency, the resonance. And then finally, with my that's the shortest oral tube, and I have the highest CV transition. I want to put this information here because if you can understand tube length, the longer the tube, the lower the frequency, the resonance, the shorter tube, the higher, the shorter the tube, the higher the frequency is the resonance. If you can remember that principle, you can do some problem solving and thinking about what's acoustically accessible to a listener. But the reality is that the actual numbers that go with what these actual CV transitions are going to be in and out of a labial versus an alveolar versus a palatal velar nasal consonant are going to vary with the vowel. Keep in mind that it's important to be able to hear through 1,000 hertz in order to hear that consonant vowel F2 transition. It'll be a little bit higher for the NG, the velar, palatal velar closure, a little bit lower for the labial closure. The nasals are voiced with voicing the fundamental frequency at approximately 250 hertz. Let's look at the spectrogram. So the words that are here, the nonsense disyllables are a PAM, a TAN, and a KANG. And I'm going to segment out the and the and the and this time they're at the end of the word. And what we see here is the low frequency nasal murmur. It's very broad, and that's that nasal murmur. And then what we also see is that the upper frequencies are really weakened in nasal production. Even though we've talked about formants and formant transitions, that upper frequency energy is really quite weak. And so we don't rely on it quite so much in listening for the nasal consonant. Mostly what we're doing is we're identifying this low frequency nasal murmur. And here we have the F2 transitions from the vowel, and it's not as easy to see those principles of F2 value for placement in these graphs. What really shows up in a spectrogram, however, is this low frequency nasal murmur. Let's talk about fricatives. Fricatives, fricatives are produced by a constriction of airflow at different locations in the vocal tract to create a turbulence, what we call a frication. The sound type is aperiodic. Fricatives are steady state. That turbulent noise is steady state. It doesn't change remarkably over the course of production of the fricative. Fricatives can be voiced or voiceless. Now, in general, what is important to think about with regard to the sound that is fricatives is it's this turbulent noise. It doesn't have necessarily a formant in it, because that's what happens when you have periodic sound, and this is aperiodic sound, and it's a very broad sound. The turbulence extends, in the case of the all the way from about 1,000 to 8,000 hertz. And then with the other fricatives, that turbulence is still broad, but not quite so broad. It extends from about 2,000 to 8,000 hertz. So fricatives have some broad information. You might be able to hear just to 2,000 hertz, and you might know that you're hearing a fricative. You might not know exactly which fricative you're hearing, but you can hear that turbulence. But because fricatives tend to go into these high frequency areas, they also require some higher frequency perception, accessibility, in order for us to correctly perceive the fricatives. So let's look at the perceptual cues that are available acoustically in fricatives. Manner of production, the fact that this is a fricative and not a nasal, not a glide, is indicated by that broadband turbulence, that aperiodic turbulence. And I've listed that broadband turbulence as extending in general for fricatives from 1,000 to 8,000 hertz, keeping in mind that 1,000 hertz is for the H, the H. Now, place of articulation. I've taken the information from Pickett, and I'm going to give you some information that's different, slightly different from what Dr. Ling says. And I've chosen to do that because I see it different consistently across researches of place of articulation cues for frication. It's not a huge difference, but there are some differences. And also because the Pickett data are more consistent with principles of tube resonance. Now, when we are listening to a fricative, we identify the place of articulation because there is some greater intensity within this broad turbulence, within this broadband turbulent sound of maybe 1,000 to 8,000 hertz, 2,000 to 8,000 hertz. There tends to be one region where there's greater intensity than others. And that region of greatest intensity in the turbulence is associated with place of articulation, where the tongue or the lips are creating this constriction. Now we can apply some tube resonance principles here to kind of predict how that's going to work out. When we were talking previously about nasals, I said that the resonance of the vocal tract was determined by the length of the vocal tract tube behind the point of constriction. Now I'm going to flip it. Now, the resonance for fricatives, the area of resonance is in front of the point of constriction. And so the shorter the area of resonance, the higher the frequency is the resonance. So the shorter the area of resonance, the higher the resonant frequency. I'm going to say this in a different way. Let's think about the most front-produced fricatives, the F and the V, the F and the V. So the area of resonance, if I'm going to bite my lip to produce an F, the area of resonance is right in front of my lip before the sound escapes into the broad atmosphere. It's a tiny little area. And the frequency region with the greatest energy for the F and the V is the highest frequency region of all the fricatives, around 6,000 hertz. And we'll see a picture of this. We'll get to see this again. Then as we move back along the vocal tract for place of constriction to the TH, the voice and voiceless TH, and where I have the tongue behind the teeth, as in case of one way that this is produced. That area of resonance is from behind the teeth to right at the front of the lips, and it also is a very high frequency, resonant frequency, also around 6,000 hertz. When I move back to alveolar point of constriction for the S and Z, the S and the Z, I have from the alveolar ridge to the front of the mouth, it's a little bit longer area of resonance. From that point of constriction to the front of the mouth, the resonant frequency is 4,000 hertz. So we see more energy around 4,000 hertz. As I move back to my place of constriction to palatal alveolars, the sh and the zh, I'm moving back a little bit. The area of resonance is the tube. The area that creates the resonance is a little bit longer, and the frequency, the resonant frequency, is a little bit lower, 2,000 hertz. Now, another thing that lowers that resonance is the fact that to produce the sh and the zh, we're rounding the lips as well. Then as I move all the way back to the h, my constriction is at the velar portion of the vocal tract, and the area of resonance extends all from the way back velar point of constriction all the way through the front of the mouth. It's the longest area, it's the longest length, the longest area of resonance. Therefore, it's got the lowest resonant frequency at 1,000 hertz. Now, if you have a listener, say you have a youngster with a corner audiogram whose aided responses only go through 1,000 hertz, you're waiting for cochlear implantation. You could still do some work with fricatives if they could hear 1,000 hertz. The youngster could hear some frication and maybe identify that age. And even these other sounds will have some lower frequency frication energy, but you might not get place and full identification of that fricative. But certainly the H, we think of as being so soft and high frequency, but you get next to a child and you've got a little doggy that you're talking about, and that doggy is tired and hot, and you say, oh, poor doggy. Hand that dog over to mom. Have mom demonstrate it. Give the child a chance with the toy, and you might be surprised at what that child says, even with hearing just through 1,000 hertz with his hearing aids. Now, fricatives with regard to voicing can be either voiced or voiceless. So the voiced fricatives have, as part of their acoustic characteristics, fundamental frequency at 250 hertz. There's also a difference between voice and voiceless fricatives with regard to the duration of that turbulent sound, that frication. The duration of voiceless fricative sound is longer than voiced. Voiceless fricative turbulence is longer in duration than voiced turbulent fricatives. Let's look at some spectrograms. So here we have voiceless fricatives, and sh, and we can see the turbulence here. And there are some darker areas. You'll see that some of these darker areas actually correspond in some part to the vowel that's about to be produced, because we're shaping our vocal tract and preparing to say those vowels. But we have this long band, this broad band of energy, and we can really see for the SH and the S that we have a greater intensity of energy here. In this case, it's a little bit above 3,000 hertz for this speaker. A little bit above 5,000 hertz for this speaker, for the S, and then it moves down this area of greater energy for the sh. Now already, this area of greater energy for the S, a little bit above 5,000 hertz. This area of greater energy for the sh, closer to 2,000 hertz. You're seeing that we don't have exact one-to-one correspondence to the numbers on the preceding slide. That's not how it works. There's not how any of this works. We're going to have some variation, but if you understand those general principles, here's our voice fricatives, you'll be able to do some problem solving while you're in teaching and therapy. These are our voiced fricatives, and one thing that happens with the most forward voice fricatives is that we lose some of this energy, but we have this broad band frication. We're seeing the formants from the vowels go straight through as well. And here we have the z and the zh, and we have higher frequency energy for the z because it's a little bit more forward in the mouth compared to the zh because it's a little bit more back in the mouth. Now, here's the h, aha. I'll segment it out. And this is simply to show you how far down into 1,000 hertz the H can go in terms of this broad band fricative energy. We could actually, this scale only goes to 5,000 hertz. We probably have energy up here to 8,000 hertz. Now you may be taken aback by how we see the formants extending across the production of the H, and that's because we don't produce sounds ah and then h and then ah. We say aha, and when I say aha, I'm keeping my jaw open for the ah, and I'm simply moving my articulators to create the H. And so I've got these areas of resonance by the shape of my vocal tract for the vowel that are impacting the H. And this impact of one speech sound over the other is constant through all of speech production, which is why we can't really pinpoint exactly where exact frequencies are going to be because of this impact of contacts. Now let's just look at an example of how place of constriction impacts the region of greatest turbulence, of greatest energy in turbulence from front to back. So here we have how the phrase is, how Shaw saw it thaw for him. And so the first phoneme in this spectrogram is the H, the H. And because of the way this spectrogram is printed out, we don't have the broadband energy that we've seen in other spectrograms, except here for the F. But we're seeing where the greatest energy is. So here we have the H, the farthest back, the constriction that's the farthest back in the mouth, moving to sh, the palatal position, from velar to palatal to alveolar. S, the greatest area of energy is moving up in frequency. We have frequency here, lower frequency for the velar, moving up in area of greatest energy, frequency area of greatest energy for sh, moving up in even more as we move forward in the mouth for the s, moving up even more as we move more forward for the thaw, the th, and then moving up even more for the most forward sound. So place of articulation for fricatives is signaled by the area of greatest energy, and we can predict whether or not that area of greatest energy in that turbulent sound is going to be lower in frequency or higher in frequency, depending upon whether or not it's a back sound versus a more forward sound.